Caution, Titanfall approaching battlefield. Stand by for Titanfall.
Ready? Go! What is happening?
Scythe, a Euro about raising your Eastern European inspired factions to glory in this game that took Kickstarter by storm in 2016. It has a cool setting, all these awesome mechs, all in what is supposed to be a 4X game. Yeah, this game is supposed to be a 4X, and it's only 2 hours long. So yeah, this is board game history. A lot to delve into here, let's get into it. Here's a quick how to play of Scythe. We're all playing as these factions, trying to get the most money, which is basically points, as fast as possible before the game ends. When the game ends, you get bonus points, bonus money from 4 different categories. First, number of these stars you place on the board. Next, how many territories you control on the board. Then every 2 resources you control. And then this building structure tile, which changes every game and gives you points based off of structures or buildings you have in certain territories. Star tokens are earned by reaching certain achievements, like getting 4 mechs, having 8 workers, or even doing a secret objective dealt at the start of the game. There's 10 different possible stars to earn, though winning a fight can be 2 of them, and the game immediately ends the instant anyone gets 6 stars. Thus, your goal as a player is to be more efficient than anyone else by either getting 6 stars and ending the game super fast while you're ahead, or by using your efficiency to have so much money that a star rushing player can't end the game without making you win. At which point, you try to maintain your lead and go for ending the game on your terms. At the start, everyone is dealt a faction mat and an action mat, which determines everyone's unique faction abilities, starting resources, and 4 available actions. Every action has 2 halves, the top plus the bottom, and you can do both with 1 action. The top 4 actions are always moving/get money, producing resources, and buying combat power. Likewise, the 4 bottom actions are always upgrading your actions, deploying a mech, constructing a building, and this last one that's impossible to summarize but insanely powerful. Bottom actions always cost resources to perform, but will always permanently improve something, so the idea is to get a bunch of resources from your tops and then spend on the bottoms as much as possible. Every action mat has the same 4 top and bottom actions, but they're not only rearranged, their costs and benefits are also different. On one mat, you can move and then upgrade. On another, you can move and then build. Deploying a mech can cost 3 iron, sometimes 4 iron. It can give you 2 money, it can give you 3 money. Every board is wildly different. And that is Scythe gameplay in a nutshell. There's no rounds, so you just do 1 action, and then do the top, or the top and the bottom. You're basically moving your workers around to produce resources, or even more workers from territories. Eventually, you can use those resources you bought or placed on the board to do bottom actions here. And then so eventually, you'll get mechs. And then combat power to start expanding on the board. Remember, getting more territories is more points at the end of the game, and then you can also start fights with your opponents to try to get those combat stars. Oh, and then how fighting works is that you move either a mech or your mini onto another player's mech or mini. Then you both secretly bid in amounts of combat power and see who had more. You can also secretly add a combat card to boost your power. Also, you're not allowed to do the same action twice in a row. Also, resources are placed on the board instead of in front of you, so you have to control the spot they're on to use them. And they can get picked up and moved around by any of your figures. Oh, and then mechs can suck up and carry workers like a bus. Okay, last one. Your main mini can move onto encounters and the middle hex to get big benefits. This middle factory being especially good because controlling it counts as 3 territories and lets you get a 5th action the first time you enter. So now we get to the long-awaited Scythe review. And to start the pros, this game looks absolutely fantastic and it's just a real looker on the table. This board is just absolutely gorgeous, just really drawing you into this mindset on collecting resources and exploring in a 1920s era setting. And what goes onto the board are these fantastic detailed wooden pieces. They're generally easy to see on the board. What really blew our minds is how every single color's meeples for their workers are different. They're different. Really awesome attention to detail here. These are going to go on your player board slots initially, where there's these thick double layered faction and player mat combinations to clearly see what's up as you move around cubes, mechs, cylinders, and even these 3D wooded buildings, with everything having their own spaces. And just look how great this game looks once you deploy mechs off your mat and onto the board as they move alongside your own character mini. And then just look at these gorgeous, great quality cards that all have their own slot on the board. There's all sorts of different coins. Come on, just look at the sheer amounts of high quality art on absolutely everything. That's excellent marks for visual design, on top of nothing really being confusing while playing. And a nice plastic insert for all the minis and plastic bags. Plastic bags, a lot of plastic bags. And actually, all this super clean iconography makes this game incredibly easy to learn and being very intuitive in understanding the rules. The rulebook is for the most part clear. Stuff like your actions are very well explained, especially with these designers' tip boxes splattered everywhere to help guide you. In fact, starting up Scythe in general is quite a clean experience when explained verbally. You do 1 of 4 actions on your turn, and then that later becomes 3 to choose from because you have to move your player pawn somewhere. To get efficiency, just go for doing your top part plus bottom on a single turn. The complexity here is not hidden in any secret cards or complex faces, which can really just get you into the efficiency-ing right away. Oh yeah, tight efficiency game. So let's get onto the gameplay pros and how Scythe has extremely tight management of resources. First of all, yeah, getting resources is good, right? Make more workers to make more from the spaces they're on. But then, producing with workers starts to cost more with more workers on the board, so you have to plan ahead to make sure you can pay to produce. As a result, the most effective strategies revolve around having 5 workers where cost is minimal, or all 8 and managing it correctly. But like we said, resource management is key because you also have to consider where to move your workers to produce what resource. So you have to plan ahead tons of turns to make sure production costs work, as well as moving workers to be in the right place prior to producing. Alternatively, you could just move your character onto encounters to try to get what you need from 3 random options. Good options here that fits this game rigid gameplay we'll get into soon. And if you need something less random, you can just buy 2 of any resource you need. Very useful to get stuff that isn't close to your starting spaces. And remember, you're doing all that management to get the right amount of resources to start spamming bottom actions. But ideally, you're also planning on how these bottoms will improve your engine to get the next improvement faster. At a certain point, you're looking to make sure you're never doing a turn without doing the top and bottom, whether that comes from having excess resources from a produced top that gets used in your next action, or just producing and then immediately spending what was produced for what's on the bottom of that produced action. Then consider how you can never do the same action twice in a row. So you're quickly realizing how to get the resources from one action, and then some from the next, and then be able to pay for the bottom action you want. But let's talk about the Scythe thing now, mechs. And people are going to be deploying these left to right on the board by using this actions, bottom ability, deploy. When you deploy your mech, you put it down on the board on a space with your worker, and it acts like a combat unit just like your character miniature. But then this also unlocks an ability for your faction. All factions have 3 related to movement and 1 for fighting. And the unique movements available to each faction are crazy, usually letting you teleport to certain hexes, and these mech abilities are great ways to leave the tiny peninsula you start on. It's definitely a very satisfying unlock as suddenly the entire board has opened up to you. Mechs don't just look cool, they are cool to use for people to want to keep building them. Remember how they can transport workers? Since these workers didn't move yet, they can move again. So how about late game moving 3 mechs, each carrying 2 workers and dropping 1 off in each hex they go through to grab 6 territories in 1 action? How's that to make movement possibilities super exciting? And then fighting. You can fight your opponent's mechs or characters to get a star from winning. Or you could even chase away their workers to deny territory and resources. Note that Scythe is never too punishing in that though, because attackers actually lose popularity for each worker they chase away. More on that later. But let's say you actually do fight, right? Well, like we said, the combatants secretly bid their power, but everyone can also see each other's max power on this track. Power can be used to pay for production, and maximizing it out is another way to earn a star. So bidding power hard is taking away from the star condition of maximizing that power. But this also gives you a chance to get the stars from winning a combat. However, there's also these secret battle cards that people have to boost their power bid, with a very useful distribution reference on the board so you can judge probabilities of anyone having the max 5 power card. So with all this hidden but manageable information, there are ways to mind game your opponent into playing more or less power. Combatants with less power don't always lose if the expected winner decides to get greedy and bid a small amount, while the underdog bids high. But on the flip side, the underdog could also bid low and get their opponent to overbid and waste power. In fact, because Scythe is mostly about resource management, the actual act of fighting is really risky, because you could potentially waste your entire movement on a lost combat, making everything there teleport back to your home base, and then you lose a lot of ground on the map. Or the bottom to your move could have immediately spent resources you stole from forcing the loser off their territory, because remember how all of your resources are on the board? But if you lost the fight, now you're behind on doing bottoms. This gets us to how Scythe has a very interesting stance on war. You have all these characters and mechs on the board that are moving around and posturing for the act of war, but not necessarily to duke it out all the time. Winning a combat though can give you a crazy surge though. So, a well-timed attack can completely destroy someone's turn economy and you get all the resources on their space, as well as getting a cool combat star. At the end of it all, Scythe is not trying to be a game all about combat, rather much of the game comes from the tension of mechs and characters walking around the board, having this threat of combat that could happen if someone mishandles their positioning or power. This keeps this feeling of tension high as more mechs get on the board, especially as players start looking for easy combat stars once they've already got their engine going, and try to close out the game with the last few stars, and people start spacing out a bit. Sounds like we're getting to gameplay progression pros. So early game of Scythe will have everyone just on their starting peninsula, and then slowly branching out to maybe make more workers, and then expand to more territories, and then eventually different types of resources. This expansion is ramped up by everyone just getting more mech unlocks as they build more and more. And these mechs never die, so their unlocks here are absolutely permanent. One particularly swingy unlock is increasing their movement by 1. So then these mechs can move 2 spaces on the board. So you can move 2 spaces and then attack someone. And then how about your player board, which has probably gotten way more improvements as you've done more second actions. You'll see benefits being exposed and costs being covered up as your economy hums more and more. Again, late game, you'll probably have so many resources while having costs reduced that you could pay for second actions more often than not. We've barely talked about buildings too, and when you build these on the board, they give your faction way more powers to use. How about this mine that lets you move from the space you're on to any of these red tunnel spaces? Wow, that's incredible movement range. Another nice one I like is a mill that lets you always produce on its hex, in addition to the default 2 hexes you pick when producing, on top of producing 1 resource on its own, similar to a worker. So there's a lot of resource management that leads to territory expansion and power posturing. But thankfully, Scythe doesn't just become a point salad, since the 2 biggest ways to get money at the end of the game are territories controlled and stars placed. Maximizing these quickly before the game ends is the big skill ceiling. There's this clever thing with the 2 action system because you absolutely want to be focused on finishing a star, but because you're encouraged to do 2 actions, you typically end up setting up little bits of the next star or stars anyways. You really gotta keep thinking ahead, especially once you factor in that once your 6 stars placed, the game immediately ends. Immediately! So there's that tightness of Scythe coming in again. Or how about raising your popularity? Because the higher popularity you have, the more points you get from every single category. You're gonna want to plan on getting a certain tier based off your initial strategy. If you're rushing the game, you won't care about having a high popularity because you'll have more start points and territories than anyone else. If you're stalling someone's rush, then yeah, you'll probably want at least tier 2 popularity. Just like managing resources, this dynamic makes you think ahead when thinking about managing popularity while simultaneously looking for opportunistic combat stars. Forcing enemy workers off territories comes with a popularity loss, so you really have to judge whether or not that's worth it. But thankfully, character minis can't carry workers, plus they're encouraged to check out encounters and also the factory, so it's easy to jump on them for an isolated fight. The risks and benefits of being defensive versus expanding rapidly are very well balanced. We also can't forget the endgame bonus and building around that to get points. Like here, we may want to account for placing buildings in these two types of spaces. Okay, so now let's get to the player interaction. And there's a decent amount here, especially come mid to late game, as everyone's just posturing in their own way on the map. There's this Cold War stare down with us piloting our mechs on frozen tundra, and all too often there can be surprise attacks. And oftentimes, those surprise attacks means the game ends because whoever won the combat puts down their final star. Come later in the game, you can even box in your opponents, not to attack, but to say, hey, I'm just gonna wall you off from all this territory. This expansion lets you really outpace your opponent in territory control. Look here, you can easily have 3 mechs drop off 2 workers each to grab 6 territories here. And then for the opponent to reclaim their territory, they can only fight a maximum of 3 times. So that's 3 territories max for them if they win every fight. Besides boxing in, there's the effort to hold the 3 territory worth factory. So now you can also be playing this King of the Hill game too. Whew, that was a lot of gameplay pros. So let's switch over to replayability, where there's these factions, right? But then you also mix and match them with these action mats. So you got the factions, mix and match with the mats, and that helps to add replayability to keep things fresh, despite there being fixed starting places for each faction on the board. You got one here, you got one there. These 2 sets of 5 boards, combined with your starting objectives and first encounter you draw from the deck, is going to give you a real healthy amount of possibilities every game. And remember, these action mats will slightly tweak your 4 actions. Also, faction mats determine your starting location, aka your opening resources. But let's go to the top now and look at these fun faction abilities. Like these Crimeans can use a combat card as any resource. Or the Saxonians can place as many stars as they want from objectives or winning combats. My absolute favorite is this one, Polenia, where every time you explore, you get to choose 2 options. That's just so many freebies. Explore like crazy on the map. More faction abilities are revealed by building mechs, where the center 2 are the real different ones. This faction is so warmongering, where it doesn't lose any popularity from attacking others' workers. You can just, oh, hello, terrorize a large group of workers without any consequence. Attack, attack, attack. Just attack, attack, attack. Plus, while we're not accounting for this in our score of base Scythe, you can pick up this expansion that gives you 2 more factions and 2 more action mats, so that's more to mix and match with. Scythe also does a pretty good job of running true to time at around that 2-hour mark. This is actually quite time efficient for such a mechanically broad game. We've talked about building up your faction with workers, mechs for combat potential, and so many different achievements. It's not uncommon that once you know the game, within 10 minutes people are quickly deploying mechs and getting upgrades. So right before we end the pros, this box just wraps up to have this diesel punk theme so clearly presented. You have all these 1920s edgy European powers just trying to go reclaim their glory, expand on the board, find the factory, and find cool tech. But hey, that's it for the pros. Now it's time for the cons. Let's get into it. So the first con is that the initial marketing and presentation of this game is misleading. Let's go ahead and read something from the back of the box here, okay? All right. Scythe is a competitive 4X game. Whoa. Okay, hold on. So a 4X is a type of empire building game where players do the 4 X's. You have the explore, you have the expand, you have the exploit, and exterminate. And to start, as you've seen in the pros, this game doesn't really have exterminate. Units never die in this game. Rather, everything returns to their base if defeated. In actuality, despite these mechs looking loaded out with weapons, you're not finding that much in this game if you actively want to win. There's only 2 possible stars to put down for winning fights, and if you bounce anyone else's helpless workers back to their home, well, you lose popularity for each worker you just attacked. Hence why fights usually only happen towards the end when trying to get those last few stars. And not even big epic fights, just small opportunistic ones. Or how Scythe claims it has the X of exploration, and well, yeah, technically yes, it's there in resolving encounters to flip over cards. Well, these are only one-time events that you likely only do 2 to 3 times a game. They typically involve you getting resources or paying money to get an immediate bottom action, and the most map-involved thing is just spawning a mech on that space. Compare this to what people normally think in a 4X game, where since maps are not always the same like they are in base Scythe, you're uncovering some sort of crucial map element as you play the game. There's a sense of wonder and tons of possibility from every discovery when it heavily alters your game plan. This allows for so much room for different gameplay possibilities and player expression to take place. You can have that one friend who's known for playing that one faction and playing them in their own unique way. But in Scythe, you're rigidly locked into a game plan from the very start, and the encounters only help speed up what you're already trying to do. On top of that, the rulebook says everyone is randomly dealt a faction and action mat. No picking and getting attached to anyone here, no siree. Now, Scythe's combat is entirely different from the exterminate you'd find in a traditional 4X, like Civilization, where a win condition is to crush your opponents by taking their capital. Now that we're still on Civilization, see how exterminate means to actually kill units, and it's actively built into a win condition to exterminate your enemy to win? That type of bloodthirsty victory is just not in Scythe. The majority of the game is spent being mindful of resource management, and you straight up can't even attack or move effectively without doing a whole bunch of Euro gameplay first. In fact, bloodthirsty victory seems to come to mind when you read some of the opening lines on the website. Players conquer territory, enlist new recruits. Yeah, that's not a focus of this game at all. Remember back in the how to play, how there was that one action that was too hard to summarize? That's enlisting a recruit. There's no soldier unit to put on the board, you just move a cylinder, and that passively gives you stuff throughout the game. Again, too lazy to explain its nuances, but this passive generation makes it arguably the strongest bottom action in the game. We're left with not really conquering territory, and enlisting recruits is barely a thematic highlight, and if anything, a Euro mechanic of upgrading your player board, not getting more troop recruits as it sounds. It's just incredibly easy to see someone finding this game with this gritty universe and theme, and think, this must be an amazing mech fighting game with our economies backing everything up. But in fact, this is the complete opposite of Michael Bay mechs blowing up everything. It's Transformers in disguise the other way, where mechs are more like buses for your workers and then position themselves to deter with only the possibility of fighting. Look, on the Scythe website, an official fact, it doubles down on being a 4X, defending that you're technically eliminating units from territory and technically exploring. Sure, while these are technically correct, you have to keep in mind that Scythe is trying to position itself as part of an iconic genre where these 4Xs are developed fully. But just like how its mechs posture and then don't really fight that often, Scythe postures its X's and then doesn't really 4X. We really would have preferred Scythe to go the Gloomhaven route, where Gloomhaven is still structurally a dungeon crawler, albeit a really weird one. Because of how much the gameplay draws from Euros, it's therefore a Euro-inspired dungeon crawler. Meanwhile, Scythe is fundamentally just a Euro game, with some 4X elements sprinkled in there. So a 4X-inspired Euro. And since it's streamlined to play in about 2 hours, you could say a 4X-inspired streamlined Euro, which honestly is a pretty unique selling point. This should have been embraced instead of disappointing and or confusing players who wanted something more like a 4X experience. And since Scythe is fundamentally Euro, well, that brings us to our next point that doesn't quite add up when you realize the game is as tight and rigid as it is. That is that Scythe is pretty wonky with balance. Let's start with these objective cards. These cards that you're dealt at the beginning have some that are clearly stronger than others. Like look at this one, having 6 units on one space. That's super easy to accomplish by just spawning workers on this worker spawn space, and then a mech shows up. Happens naturally, right? You don't really have to think about it. Compare that to this monstrosity of an objective. Have 2 or less money, at least 4 workers, and 7 popularity? You can't even spend money that quickly, and most bottom actions reward you with more money. On top of all that, this needs 7 popularity, which definitely needs multiple turns to achieve, all while you don't have money. This would never occur naturally, and in fact, needs so many turns to achieve that it's faster to just get a star from doing the same bottom action 4 times. Certain objectives being too strong are really concerning in this game because not only are they points, they literally help you end the game faster, so by just having another star essentially for free is too good. We're not sure why there wasn't any variant to just get 1 free reshuffle of your objective hand. That, or objectives being better balanced to have less super easy or super hard ones in the first place. This leads us perfectly to faction imbalance, and let's start with this Blue Nordic Kingdom, where their special ability is that workers can swim, or they can walk across rivers. Okay, this sounds great, but in practice it's not when you realize that workers don't really move that often just as themselves. Oftentimes, you'll just end up using this ability like 2 to 4 times in early game, then mechs do all the moving from then on, meaning that you really have no constant faction ability for the rest of the game. They should really be getting just better starting resources in general, because currently their starting territories are just terrible. On the flip side is the Red Rustvit Union. We like to call them the Russians. Now their ability lets them repeat the same action as much as they want, meaning there's not a single weak action mat combination they have. Plus, they can teleport to the factory in the middle as an unlocked ability. Wow, that's an incredible speed and map control. Like, teleport halfway across the map to the territory that's worth 3 territories at the end of the game and be the first one there to get dibs on unlocking a 5th action? Also, there's Crimeans, who can use battle cards as any resource once per turn. That's not only insane flexibility that can efficiently give you the boost needed for any bottom action, but also a massive tempo advantage because there's openings where you can do your bottom actions a turn earlier than anyone else because of that extra resource. And while they don't start with battle cards, that's a non-issue because 1, they start next to a food territory, so you can easily just enlist to passively generate battle cards for the whole game. And then 2, their combat ability is stealing cards from opponents. Oh, and then the action boards, the things you combine your player board with, that's imbalanced too. A good amount of this issue is how every star is not made equal, where some are just much easier than others to fulfill. Well, if you have a board that really helps you achieve placing mechs or enlisting, those are easy stars from doing 4 actions that give huge early game boosts. But then if you have a board that really leans towards upgrading, well, you have to do that 6 times for a star. The action boards also determine who goes first in this game. And going first is a big deal in Scythe because, remember, when anyone places down their 6th and final star, the game immediately ends. Just by having 1 more turn in a game is consistently the difference between winning and losing. And once you're experienced with Scythe, games at most will take around 20 turns. Usually even less if you get lucky with certain objectives and encounters. Like, think of this industrial action board that has a 1 on it, meaning that it always goes first. The fact that this is good with all faction boards is a little iffy. Yeah, actually, it's this really interesting mishmash balance when combining these factions and mats. There's banned setups in the official FAQ, even mentioned by the designer himself. These are Crimea plus Patriotic and Rustvit plus Industrial. The reality is that the gripes we just talked about earlier are showing all their colors. You're just so strong that a player who either knows what they're doing or just follows a step-by-step turn list on BGG can end the game in little over a dozen turns before anyone else can really compete. So it is possible for some particularly savvy players to encounter these and have some scuffed early playthroughs as they see the potential. It doesn't even have to be the perfect opening. They can do it suboptimally and still be ahead by quite a big margin compared to other new players. This is even more so if you're not the type of person to not research a game and just go ahead and buy it because it looks cool at a store. And Scythe does look really cool on shelves. And these 2 combos, yeah, they are always banned because Scythe always has the same exact starting locations and map resources. This is demonstrably why Scythe's rigid nature really hurts the game, because the actual game variance you have, that is, who sits next to you, what tweaked bottom actions you have, and starting objectives/encounters are not balanced enough to make use of a fixed board. So now, whoever ends up with Rustvit or Crimea has such a good edge. Or how about factions just directly countering each other? There's the Black faction, who likely wants to be fighting more than usual because of the unlimited stars he can place down from victories. But then if you have Yellow in the game, which spawns right next to Black, who can steal battle cards every time they fight, this is a direct counter to Black going out and attacking freely when Black starts with low power but tons of cards. But wait, there must be some politics. Can't people just attack that person to hurt them? Well, sort of. Reminder that Scythe really prioritizes building up first. And so if you go too hard on fighting, you'll find that the point payouts are negligible unless you're this faction, Saxony. Plus, moving to attack is not something that's consistently available to you. So you're best off just doing this action once to attack, get your stars, get your 2 stars from that one moving twice, and then never attacking again. Scythe is an extremely rigid game, meaning there's such low politics or very little emergent randomness. The game really does have chess-like play with tons of tight positioning counterplay down the road, but that needs to be designed very specifically, because balance issues hit harder in this design since outliers will always be stronger or weaker and can't be checked by randomness or players ganging up on them. While we haven't extensively tested these expansions look to be the way to go to break up this rigidness. There's modular game boards and crazy new additions from the extra factions, action boards, and even airships. With the base game, we recommend at a minimum following the designer's patch to ban these 2 setups here. And finally, I had to know what they were thinking when they made these resource multiplayer tokens all brown. Why isn't oil blue, iron gray, and food yellow like the regular resource pieces? That's it for the cons, now it's time for the nitpicks. Let's go back to where we talked about this game being very tight. You start in the same exact place for each faction, and even though your action boards are altered, it's not hard to start to memorize certain openings. This can make the first few turns feel very mechanical. This goes into how early game, this game can be a bit solitaire. What your opponents do on their starting peninsula doesn't really affect you, and everyone's just building themselves up. Remember, at the beginning of the game, no one will have these mechs yet. Compare this to other 4Xs, like we have to go back to Civilization, where not only is the board always different, but politics plays a role in even early game movement. Scythe really has no such thing. The rules even say you can play with alliances and bribes, but nothing's binding and says not to trade in tournament play, which clearly shows you how the game was intended to be played. Plus, you can only trade coins anyways since resources are on the board, and coins aren't that impactful towards your engine in the first place because you'll usually have plenty. And since you're restricted from moving out of your peninsula until later, plus you only start out with 1 combative unit early, it can take a couple turns for the game to get to the point where you're eyeing your opponents, especially since fighting early comes at the opportunity cost of speeding up your action efficiency. Then let's move into one mechanic in specific, the enlistment action. Yep, we're finally gonna explain it. Enlisting not only lets you unlock a sizable benefit right away, I just got 2 popularity, like that, it also passively lets you get a small kickback anytime anyone sitting next to you does the same bottom action that matches your enlistment unlock. So maybe you enlisted the mech action? Well, anytime your opponents around you do the deploy, then you get that kickback of 1 money. This is really clunky to actually play with. First, doing this bottom action is difficult to keep track of with others. Like the worst case of this is someone upgrading and then just moving cubes around on their player board. Are you going to keep track of someone doing that on their player board to the left and right of you? People are mostly kept to themselves in solving the tight efficiency puzzle of the board. Then, yeah, it's a bottom action. So you would have to wait for someone to activate the top action, then decide to do the bottom where it's even more out of vision for you. Really, this starts having problems when combined with the go on each other's second actions encouragement in the rulebook, where maybe the choice whether or not to use their second action affects your turn. So you have to wait. Not all the time, but it can happen and leads to awkward pausing of the game where you're like, oh, did you build? Or deploy? Or yeah, did you do it last turn? To avoid this, it becomes mandatory that you loudly announce anytime you're doing a bottom action. I produce, and I'm building. I am building, guys. I'm building. Yeah, not only is this obnoxious, but it just messes with turn-on-turn pacing. Yes, the rulebook says to do this, but there's got to be a better way to design this, right? Then let's get to the visuals, where it can be kind of hard to see what's going on because your resources are on the board. Yeah, ever think of why more games don't do this? It can lead to all these situations where mechs are blocking resources or resource multiplier tokens. Plus, since Scythe doesn't have a stacking limit, that is, restrict you from just bunching up a ton of things in one space, that just enables these hilariously messy stacks. There's also some visual clunkiness when learning the game and how you have to constantly lift mechs, workers, structures, you name it, to see the appropriate effects underneath. This is especially the case for opponent mech unlocks, because you wouldn't know what their unlocks are unless you look across the table and see it, usually having to lift up something in the process. Then, player count. Okay, so the best player count for Scythe is 4 or 5 players. That way expansion is way more interesting, with earlier fights way more likely because there's less distance to travel. 3 is not as good, but still okay. 1 to 2 is when you hit really weird problems. See, the board never scales at all, so if you play with 1 player against the bot, or 2 players with a friend, there's just so much open space to just expand. The game totally works, it's just that you could easily feel like you're playing Farming Simulator with people growing their own stuff and never fighting each other. Oh, and then while we're on the topic of solo mode, geez, do these solo mode reference cards need to be on a single sheet? It is unbelievably irritating to keep picking them up and moving them around to define the automa actions. Oh, also, the less players you have, the worse this central factory is because its pool of cards for your 5th action is determined by how many players you have. So again, all the more reason to play at 3+. Now it's time for a recommender score where we try to critically evaluate the pros and cons of the game. And Scythe is going to get a 7 out of 10. It is good. A decent amount of what is dragging this game down is it's balanced alongside how it's presented. Because we're trying to evaluate how well the game does and what it's trying to do, well, if it's trying to be a 4X and fails to meet most of that goal, it has to be docked. Remember, this is a 4X inspired streamlined Euro, not actually a 4X. Yet the streamline lets you play in this 4-action Euro, with different bottom actions and upgrades to prioritize, and always this minigame of making sure the right action is there when you want it because you can't do 2 in a row. Even if the board at times may look like a 4X with counterplay positioning and tense endgame battles, it's not exterminating. We have to stress that Scythe is a warmonger's worst nightmare. Even if you play as Saxony and can actually fight a bunch, it's best to just build up resources for the first couple stars, and then for the combat stars, just get 1 or 2 extra ones over the normal 2. Scythe's core gameplay is to look at what you're dealt, then choose to prioritize a couple of things. If one of those is combat, then sure, yeah, you can fight. But mech bashing is far from the theme of the game, and it's far more effective to only fight once or twice for a quick star and then run around grabbing territories or vice versa. Because you can never escape the fact that Scythe's gameplay at its core is an economy race to see who ends the game faster, and that just influences everything you're doing. The game's tightness is really shown in how good players can consistently end the game by turn 18. A set number, turn 18. There is an optimal way to do your player boards and exploit your starting peninsula the best. Newcomers be warned, the game is initially easy to learn, but you're not really playing Scythe at a coherent level until you have some degree of mastery. Because of the game being so inflexible with only a few surprises per game, it's hard to stand a chance against experienced players if you aren't playing basically perfectly. It's not uncommon for veterans versus newcomers to have extreme point gaps come the end of the game, and for some to feel alienated. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's something that reflects how there is a correct and proper way to play the game, not quite like a 4X game where games are swingy and filled with drama with new information and game variables popping up left and right. So yeah, the packaging and presentation go a long way in making this palatable, but Scythe is far from a casual game night unless everyone is new. But then again, since it's so accessible, Scythe works as a great gateway big box game. Not only is it a fantastic sampler of resource management, transporting mechs, RPG elements from exploring, some King of the Hill fighting, thinking about the multiple different milestones on the way to victory, but there's certainly really good depth in late game positioning, and then scoring avenues with popularity management. And this is all in about 2 hours, where 4 actions generally stay engrossing to keep efficiencying. Also, if you're the type of person that doesn't play games too competitively, you could play it at 2-player and just really enjoy the economic elements of it. The game still works. Or you could play it with 4 players to move out your mechs to the factory in the middle and fight a lot more. There can be some diplomacy elements if your group is pro-fighting, but you always want to be careful of hurting your efficiency too hard by being too pro-war early on. It's not a game filled with endless possibilities with constant adapting and player expression. It is just Scythe, a very tight game with its own unique efficiency quirks. Just be good at Scythe, and maybe you'll get in more than 2 fights a game. Maybe it was trying to be more epic. Maybe it was. But it is just currently a good gateway mini 4X-ish. In fact, some great evidence on how hard you can take Scythe and how popular it is Scythe Digital. And the success of this digitally really speaks to how, yeah, this game has crazy appeal and depth despite having some wacky balancing issues. And then see how digital excels because Scythe's mechanics take priority over table talk? We can't really talk about the expansions due to time constraints, but for base game Scythe, the hype is overall very understandable. But that's it for our recommender score. Now it's time for our personal scores on the game.
3 out of 10 personal score, a bad time for me. There's not enough fighting, there's too much doing uninteractive Euro stuff, players be ending the game way too early so I don't even get to try out the feel-good bottom actions. And worst of all, the game lied to me. I see beautiful artwork of mechs, I see beautiful minis of mechs. Everything looks perfect for a dope-ass war game to take place, but then Scythe literally hard limits how much you can and should be fighting. But that's what this personal score would have looked like a few weeks ago before I delved in deep for this Scythe review. My actual score right now is a 5 out of 10 average time. I've come to appreciate more of Scythe's depth and nuances, but at the end of the day, I find the game just as frustrating as it is enjoyable. Time for some background. I've actually played Scythe a handful of times over the years. I remember my first game was back in college when some dude excitedly brought out Scythe, and I thought, it looked awesome. He was all like, yeah, you get resources and then you go out getting territories while fighting with mechs. And I'm thinking, damn, this game is gonna be sick as fuck. So I got dealt Saxony and went on a warmongering rampage until I ran out of steam at my 4th star. Then got super bored as I was slowly getting back more power and combat cards before suddenly the owner of the game just got his 6th star. He was super ahead, by the way. He had like 70 something points, while second place had around 50, and I only had like 30-ish. My first impression was that Scythe was super restrictive and anti-fun. That impression didn't really change over the next few playthroughs, all of which probably happened with like a year between them, and a similar result of me having like 20 to 30 points. And the winner, who I shit you not has always been the owner of the game, getting their 6th star and winning at like 60 to 80 points. Like, look at this footage from last year where I'm doing God knows what with only 1 star and being hopelessly behind, alongside a few other players at the table. Like, it was very clear which players were actual contenders. I distinctly remember playing Crimea and trying to meander around, exploring the map and trying to get some cool shit to happen with encounters. Spoilers, nothing cool ever happened. Eventually, it started to get through my thick skull that you weren't supposed to play this game like a 4X if you wanted to have fun. And also at some point, I came into possession of my own copy of Scythe. It was finally time to assess this game properly for once, as a reviewer, instead of just being invited to play Scythe by people who owned it and subsequently getting destroyed. Here's a little peek into our reviewing process. So whenever I'm assessing a game's balance, the first thing I do is theory craft. I look through the game's components and come up with strategies that I think would be strong. Then I test them out to see if I was on the dot or not. This may or may not result in further strategies and theories being developed. After all of that, I then go online to see if there's already a metagame of dominant strategies I can compare my ideas against. I do this so that instead of having biases formed by others online, I have my own biases that I can now compare and contrast with what the general online consensus is, therefore having a more complete picture of the game's balance as a whole. And then of course, I test what I've read online. Scythe to date has been the only game to completely stump me on its strategy, where I instead had to just go online and look at what people were saying. I've tried going hard on pure Euro and turtling. Didn't work, was too slow. I've tried attacking often and hard to deny resources. That ended up weakening and slowing me down too much. I've tried doing a more balanced approach and filling in stars as they come, based on what cards I got from encounters, factory, combat cards, etc. Also didn't work. Too slow again. Normally my methodology results in me either winning or at least doing very well, but Scythe, I kept losing and losing and losing. So, after rigorous research from watching FOMOF and Joy Division, plus reading some strategy from BGG and various Scythe blogs, I now feel like I have a very good understanding of the game. And finally, I got to have a session where I was the dude who brought his copy of Scythe and destroyed everyone else he invited, ending way earlier than the rest of the table and having like 80 points with Polania Mechanico, while second place only had 50. And this was even after I realized I made a mistake and could have ended a few turns earlier. That didn't actually feel that good. I kind of just felt like a dick who's continuing this weird, vicious cycle of Scythe bullying. It is here that I issue a warning to anyone interested in picking up Scythe. Make sure that you and your group are actually all newbies and mostly play with the same people. I've read numerous stories of friends having a grand old time messing around with Scythe and having games that end in like 30 to 40 turns instead of the expected less than 20 once players get good. Then after a bunch of games, those friends all eventually get good together and Scythe transforms into an entirely different game, one that has a ton of depth and strategy when everyone is playing at this high level. Despite its gross imbalances from Crimea, Rust Fiat, certain objectives, certain encounters, I especially emphasize everyone being noobs and playing with the same group so that you'll avoid this thing where the owner of the game ends up playing Scythe with a bunch of different people, so then only the owner ends up getting good, but then everyone else they play with isn't on the owner's level and ends up just getting crushed. Don't be that guy. At that point, you'd be better off just buying the digital version so you can get quicker, more competitive games that will be much more satisfying to play. Scythe to me has this really bizarre skill floor that you have to cross in order to reasonably engage with everything it has to offer. You have to learn all these Scythisms, like how going for certain objectives or stars will straight up lose you the game more often than not. Or how you have to sequence your actions properly with your action mat in such a way so that you can eventually fight effectively, in addition to getting there quickly while simultaneously obtaining other stars along the way. You're really not allowed to just do whatever and adapt to work your way towards a win condition. You have to identify what you're going for right off the bat upon seeing what you're dealt, and then dogmatically work towards those specific stars. And you may be asking, why is Scythe now an average 5 out of 10 for me now? This all still sounds pretty bad, right? Well, now that I know what these Scythisms are, it's actually pretty decent to engage with as a game now. That, and I've always loved the art and minis. If those didn't exist, this would easily drop down to a below average 4 out of 10. But yeah, Scythe would be much, much higher for me if one of these two things were the case. Either the game's stars, objectives, and encounters were balanced, so it was more feasible to just go for whatever stars you wanted, or if the game was way more swingy, random, and mobile. So, like, maybe just get rid of rivers as a mechanic. One of the beauties of area control games is supposed to be how imbalances can get padded out purely because of player interaction and ganging up on the powerful player. Scythe, seen as how it's a mishmash of all sorts of concepts, sits in a weird middle ground and gets the worst of both worlds for me, where yes, the fighting does matter, but it's gate-kept behind extremely rigid Euro gameplay and map design. As a result, you can't have the noobs just work together to fight the experienced players, seen as the knowledgeable player will know openings and just out-Euro the noobs, resulting in earlier stars and more of a fighting force early on. It would also probably help if everyone in our friend group was at a similar skill level, but I digress. I've been talking too long. Go listen to Ashton now.
My personal score for Scythe is going to be a 5 out of 10. I have an okay time with it. Okay, so Scythe is incredibly easy for me to just jump into, right? The game is just putting your player pawn down, bam, the efficiency just starts right away. The more I play Scythe, the more engrossed I am in just weaving this perfect sequence in this action board. This also meets the map decently well. There's a good amount of places to move my little cute meeple workers, and then different buildings to sequence on the map with cool abilities, and then super fun balancing that popularity track for late game scoring as opposed to just spending it. But yep, I do feel like the enjoyment for me can often hit a brick wall because the progression just isn't quite in depth as much as I would like it to be. Due to how you can only build 8 workers and how mechs don't strictly help your economy, you can't produce enough cool resources for a Euro feeling game where I actually just want to keep going. I want to keep upgrading and just having cool combo-y turns. Oh, but hey, Scythe is all about balancing with your fighting, right? And I find this actual combat system to be enjoyable. It's full of tense mind games with only going up to 7 power, which I think is really cool. And then also just managing your hand of combat cards. But then in reality, when this coincides with the game states, well, you're not fighting that much in Scythe, so my overall enjoyment of combat overall is a little iffy. Sometimes I'll end a game and realize I only fought once, but was engaged from the mid to late game threat or opportunity for me to fight more to win the game. But hey, I barely fought at the end of the day, so it was a slight unsatisfying feeling. I do have to note that the cool theme and presentation is making me gravitate towards this more than I usually would. I kid you not, this box is so beautiful, with a good amount of depth, and I bet that if I saw this in high school, I would have instantly bought it and would be raving about it all the time. At this point for me though, I've played so many board games that expand on ideas here more, like especially if I wanted a 4X, well, I would just play this legendary Kevin Wilson Civilization that I've been teasing throughout this video. The map is actually different every game with actual areas to explore, and that's awesome because the starting Scythe positions are already getting a little stale. But more importantly, it just goes harder in how you win the game, as in there's 4 conditions that immediately win you the game, rather than Scythe's 10 categories that are milestones. I like that clear 4 conditions as it makes games more tense. And look, if you pursue a military victory, it doesn't do that pansy chicken thing of letting your units just bounce back to base. Oh, no, your units actually die. Another super cool thing that Civ does, it gives you the economic phase, then the movement phase every single turn. So that is a really cool encouragement to keep attacking and have your economy hum along. Yeah, compare this to Scythe, where you're often attacking or moving by giving up some of your economy. When I'm moving out mechs in Scythe as a result, it doesn't feel as satisfying as just going hard on military in Civilization. Scythe fits this cute niche of being this streamlined Euro, not so 4x that bare bones satisfies me with 4 people. We did it! That is the end of the long requested Scythe review. My goodness, that was quite a journey. I'm actually working on a behind the scenes of me making this review, so that should be coming out soon. Whew, yeah. Please let me know what reviews you want to see in the future. We'll try to get around to as many popular ones as we can. I mean, we got around the Scythe, so we read the comments. Anyways, thanks to our patrons for making videos like this possible. We got Manuel G, Brian C, Clifford H, Aaron W, Max B, Bora, Jeremy MC, Charlie P, Quinton S, MS, Travis R, Alva Y, Bumps K, Brian D, Jennifer L, Matt G, Spring 71, Ryan J, Brad G, 2 out, period, Mark A, James M, Evan B, Charles B Jr., Josh J, Basketball, Rado, Sophie, Brian Z, Colin L, Hudson T, Pearson B, Omar F, MY, Ethan P, Bradley J, Josh C, Galvin V, Jork S, SS Co, Alex L, Rob R, 2022, Dave F, Josh R, Pat, Cyril C, Il Wayne, Kyle M, Amir H, Right Left Spin, Keanu S, Owl Bucks, Kyle C, John P, Nicholas R, Robin, Andre, and we got 3 Mads cardboard. We got ZL, Jeff L, Peter Z, and this guy right there. We also got our Mad Lady cardboard. We got Amy. Remember to like, comment, subscribe. Yeah, all that stuff. Yeah, see you guys later. That was Scythe. My goodness, we did it. Bye-bye.